This week in CometChat, we're going to take a look at transient messages using the JavaScript SDK. This is a special type of message because it's not one that's stored in any database and it can only be viewed in real time. Let's take a look right now. We'll start on the CometChat website. On here, we'll head over to developers and then to documentation. What I want to do is head over to SDKs and select the JavaScript Web SDK. Here, we're going to scroll down to messaging and we're going to expand that out and head to transient messages. Transient messages are a special type of message. They're only available in real time and they're not actually saved or tracked anywhere. It's good if you want to keep things anonymous or only one time for things that are only online when people are online as well. To send a transient message, we're going to be using the sendTransientMessage method. In order to receive it, we need to listen to the onTransientMessageReceived method, which is part of the message listener. Inside of CometChat, transient messages can be sent to users as well as groups, and we'll get into more in terms of how this is done inside of VS Code. But for now, we want to have a few things assigned, such as the receiver ID, receiver type, and the data we want to convey. This is passed into the CometChat transient message, and then we send that transient message once that class has been created. In order to view it, however, in real time, we need a listener, the message listener, where we're listening to the onTransientMessageReceived method and registering an event depending on how we want to interact with it. With all that theory done, let's jump into VS Code and try this out. Here's the project we've been working on in the last couple of videos. After a login has been completed, we're going to add in a code here to send a transient message. The first thing we're going to do is create the receiver ID. This will just be Adrian so that I can send this to myself. The next thing we need to do is set up the receiver type. Now for the receiver type, it's just going to be to another user. So I'm going to set this as CometChat.receiver_type.user. Make sure that this is all in capitals. The next thing we need to do is send some data. Now for the data here, I'm going to create my own data called live_reaction. Here I'm going to pass in heart. Basically, I want to pass in a heart emoji into my app as part of this transient message. This is something I can update in the UI as part of the message listener later on. But now let's define the transient message. Here I'm going to create a new class by calling transient message equals new space CometChat.transientMessage, passing in the receiver ID as well as the receiver type and the data to create that transient message. All we really have to do now is send it. In order to send a transient message that we've defined, we pass in CometChat.sendTransientMessage and pass in the transient message itself. That's it. Our transient message has now been sent, but in order for us to capture this inside of an application, we need a listener. Transient messages are only viewed in real time, so this real-time listener will only show it once it's been delivered. Let's have a look at how we set this up. Now, in terms of any type of message listener, we need to create a listener ID. So let's define a listener ID here by what it's doing. In this case, it's listening to transient messages. So I'm going to define this as transient_message_listener. Now I'm going to add a message listener by calling CometChat.addMessageListener. In here, I'm going to pass in two things. The first will be the listener ID that we've just created. And the next thing will be the new space CometChat.messageListener class. Now, as part of this message listener class, we're going to be only listening for one specific thing, and that is the onTransient message received. Basically, when a transient message is received by this message listener, it's going to perform a specific action. Now, this action is going to pull out the variable here for the transient message, and we're going to console log this out. In your own application, you can create some UI state based on the message itself, but for this example, we're just going to console it out to make it nice and simple. We're going to view this transient message, and ideally, we should just be able to see the data that's involved in there as well, which will be the live reaction that we've created. With all of that done, we've set up all the essentials for transient messages to work. We can now test these out. I always like to put real-time listeners at the very top of my applications so that once we send a message, they should trigger. Let's test all of this out. Essentially, after we send it, we should trigger the onTransient message, and this should show us basically what's inside a transient message. Let's test this out, but first let's fix this to be uppercase. The next thing we need to do is open up Chrome. I've got a live server running here so I can test this out. In here, I'm going to open up the debugging tool and refresh this page. We're going to see that the transient message comes across here and it's console logged out. If we open up this transient message, we can see that its receiver ID is Adrian. It's got the live reaction here with the heart, which means that it all has come together. Transient messages work the same for users as they do for groups. The only thing you need to do is change the receiver ID to the group you're assigning to and the receiver type to group. That's basically it. Finally, it's worth noting that when you do get transient messages coming across, you get a number of parameters that you can utilize for the app UI. You get the sender of who originally sent the message, as well as the receiver ID it's intended for. You get the receiver type as well as the data itself. If we take a look at our example from earlier, we can see that while we get the data as well as the receiver ID, we also get the sender in here. In this example, I used Superhero1 to send the transient message. It also gives you all the details about Superhero1, which basically can be used, including the avatar as well as when they were last active, so that this can also update the UI state in your application. I hope that you guys enjoyed this week's video on transient messages. In next week's video, we're going to take a look at delivery and read receipts. And if you're looking for that video, you should be able to find it just up here. Awesome.